One term that comes up often in ethos inquiry zone training is data statements. So what is a data statement and how do we use these? In 2021, Ethos is full STEM ahead. Invest in future scientists by supporting our mission.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm Douglas Hunnings, and I'm the Director of Primary STEM Education here at the ETHOS Innovation Center.
And I'm John Taylor, Director of STEM Education here at the ETHOS Innovation Center. So glad to be with you today as we have some awesome questions that teachers are submitting that we just love to talk about. So Douglas, what do you have today?
And today is one that I really enjoy, and it's all about data statements. Ooh. So their question is, what are data statements and why do we use them?
Yeah, this is really your thing too. I mean, you make good use of data statements.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and explain what it is. So data statements is a term that I coined while I was in the classroom, and it's a way to help students explain the data that they collect. So this is like the data analysis piece. I know that when I was teaching and I was using the inquiry process, John, this step, data analysis, is one of the hardest pieces for me. My students could collect the data. They could tell me what they collected, but to explain it, that's where the hard part, that's where the analysis came, because data statements I found as a way to help my students be able to prove or disprove their hypothesis. So to give a definition to data statements, it is a complete sentence explaining what the students collected. It's explaining that data. For example, we could say, let's say they are charting the weather. Maybe they're studying different types of weather. And they observed that 3 days it was sunny and 3 days it was rainy. So instead of just saying sunny 3 days, rainy 3 days, the students would write complete sentences. They would say, the weather was sunny for 3 days. The weather was rainy for 3 days. So see, it really helps write a complete thought, and it helps us to provide evidence when we're ready to create our conclusion.
Yeah, this is such a subtle thing. You're like, well, they've already had the data. They're just restating the data. But this really is about processing the data for the students one more time. I mean, taking the time to actually have to write it out in complete sentences is forcing the students to think about their data intelligently, thinking even on a higher order on what does it really mean, what does it really represent. And you gave some nice examples, but these could be very robust statements as they are being very particular with describing what that data really means and what it means to them, which as a teacher can be very revealing, because sometimes you're like, oh, it's obvious, they saw the three, that, that's what that is. But the kids interpreted it completely differently than we expected, and they're going in a different route. And these data statements help to flush a lot of that out.
Yeah, because another example could be, let's say that they are comparing amounts that they collected of different liquids. So one, like we mentioned earlier, how we said the days, how many days it was sunny, they could say, there were 5 inches of the green solid collected, and there were 7 inches of the blue. Well, they could do that, or they could say there were the blue liquid was 2 inches greater, or 2 inches were collected more than the green. So see, it's a way to be able to compare as well. So not only just tell us what happened, but to show that analysis if you're trying to prove that maybe something was going to grow or you were going to collect more of one item than the other.
Yes, and there's a lot of power here for going cross-curricular with this, because if you're talking about compare contrast, you're talking about summation, and you're talking about different language arts components. And now when the students are doing their science, they're documenting that, creating these data statements as documentation, using what they've learned in language arts, make these full statements that are actually helping you, meet the standards for your language arts and the science at the same time. And the students are engaging more as you'd want a person to engage in a scientific forum. And these statements have a lot of benefit throughout the lab process. They're not like a one-off and then we move on. These can carry on to later on in the investigation.
And you know, John, one question that teachers have asked me when have been able to talk about data statements in our different PD sessions, they're like, but when will I give my students a chance to write these data statements? I don't have that big word. I don't have time to do it. Well, for me, you know, our students would do their lab during my, you know, what I had during my science investigation time, but then our data statements were constructed during our literacy block. You know, some teach, you know, there was times that you have to have like a 90-minute reading, a 90-minute writing. Use that writing time to have the students create their data statements. So see, this is a way, because they are practicing, like you mentioned, language arts skills. There, you could really assess those data statements if you need a language arts grade.
Yeah, this isn't worksheet language arts. This isn't randomness. This is ownership. This is something I really did. And I think this can be used then as you look at other passages or other reading that they do, that they can see that there's relevance in this because I've experienced that myself. The challenge we talk about too is when you get into the writing a conclusion, which is another good crossover to your cross-curricular component. Data statements fit inside that conclusion, because as these students are collecting these give a bulk to their support for their statements and their conclusion. And I should back up a little bit. Like Douglas, how many data statements should students collect in an investigation? What do you think?
Well, what I would do is I would have the students when they're analyzing it is to look at all the data that they collected and start turning them into data statements. So we would just spend a day. That's all they would do. Then what we would do to get ready to do our conclusion, we looked at our hypothesis and our guiding question and see, would those data statements be able to fit it? A quick exercise I would do with my students, which they would do in the classroom, but you can easily do this at home. One person reads the guiding question, another person responds with the data statement. And you start looking at, do they connect? Are they totally isolated? And then as my students go through this exercise, they're able to start eliminating data statements that don't do a great job of supporting whether the hypothesis is proven or disproven. And after we've done this a couple times, then I try to strive for my students to pick 4 data statements to use for their conclusion.
Yes, I like this because you're doing peer review. You're doing a simple peer review. You're developing these learning communities as these students are in these investigations. And it's just, you know, the carryover to you know, the real world, to what we want them to experience later on in the upper grades and on later on in life it's just so neat because it makes a lot of sense. And as they have to decide on these questions, what are those 4 or 5, whatever the teacher is deciding, 4 is a good number, I think. But they are using high order thinking skills. And this is times where I know it depends again on what you're doing in your writing block. It's an opportunity. If you're doing Venn diagrams, something like this, a Venn diagram in a classroom working with students, and I've done that as an exercise with kids because it helped them to decide what were the most important items. Again, it depends on what's going on in your writing. It only makes sense to let the 2 complement each other.
So data statements I found really helped me feel like I was, you know, taking things off my plate. I wasn't feeling like I was adding more, but whether it was helping free up some of my time.
Now, I'm going to ask you then, I know in the conclusion, you and I understand where that fits, the data statements, how they work. But if we're not talking today so much about conclusions, but if you look at your structure for a conclusion, you usually broke that up into a few components with that data statements being right in the middle.
I did. So when I would have my students create a conclusion, we started off with stating whether your hypothesis was proven or disproven.
Okay.
After they made that statement, then that's where we brought in those data statements, because I would tell my students, your data statements are evidence to support whether your hypothesis was proven or disproven. Again, John, I'm going away from right or wrong.
Yes.
Because that was a term that gave some of my students anxiety. So I said, you need to tell me, was it proven or disproven? Your hypothesis can be disproven and you still are successful in your investigation. That's why I went away from the right or wrong.
Oh, this is so good.
After they wrote their data statements, including transitions, because if you just write your statements, it's going to be choppy. So I would also show them how to transition from one statement to another, which is another language arts piece.
Yes.
After our data statements, then it was something that was really cool. What are future investigations? Because I wanted to start thinking, okay, based on this result, what other questions do you have? That's the inquiry approach. It's a big circle. And then what could be a future investigation that you could do based on your results? Now, that didn't mean that they were going to. They could on their own time, and it didn't require, because really, if I had 24 students, I could have 24 different investigations that we could do.
Right.
But I still want them thinking about that process, because that's what scientists do. They have a question, they go answer it, and then that leads to other questions. And that's the whole process of thinking like a scientist. So that's how I structure proven or disproven, your data statements, future investigation.
Yeah, it's funny. We start with data statements, and now we're really talking about the conclusion a lot, because it does flow really nicely.
Yeah, so if you give that time for students to really invest in those data statements and choose what they want, when it comes time for that conclusion, they basically have done the bulk of the work already. It's just organizing your ideas.
Right. Yes. I don't know how many times I've had students who write a conclusion. I'm like, you never concluded.
Yeah, I know.
No support. So this forces them to do both, which is really nice. So,
well, I'm glad that the teacher brought this up, and then we were able, John, to take time to really talk about this. And I am excited that we can offer this as a resource to help teachers.
Yes, very much so. All right.
All right. Well, I guess it is time to say goodbye. So we'll see ya.
We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.